In the winter of 1913, Carl Jung sat alone at the writing table in his house on the shore of Lake Zurich, in the particular quiet that follows a very large decision. The formal severance from Sigmund Freud was complete. The letters had been sent and answered. The professional alliance that had shaped the preceding 6 years of Jung's life had closed, quietly, like a door that has been left open too long, finally swinging to its latch. Outside, the lake was dark and still. Inside, Jung held a pen above a blank page and wrote a single question, the question that would occupy him for the remaining 48 years of his life. What is the myth I am living? It was not a question he expected to answer that evening. He was not sure it was the kind of question that admitted of an answer in any ordinary sense. What he knew, sitting there in the winter stillness with the ink barely dry, was that he had been living as though he already knew who he was, and that this assumption, however reasonable it might have appeared from the outside, had recently begun to feel like a very small room. He was 38 years old. He had a family, a practice, a considerable reputation, and a developing body of work. And yet, in the specific way that matters most, he was not certain he had yet made the acquaintance of himself. This is where any serious account of Jung must begin, not with his theories, not with his disagreements, not with the difficult professional rupture that preceded that winter evening, but with the question itself, because the question, in Jung's understanding, was not merely a personal one, it was the central question. The question every human being was, in some fashion, living with whether they knew it or not. Jung came to believe that most people never ask it directly. Most people live inside a story that was partly given to them and partly assembled from available materials, and this story is coherent enough and workable enough that the larger question never quite surfaces. The daily life fills in around it. The roles and responsibilities settle into place. The years accumulate, and somewhere in the middle of all that continuity, if they are very quiet at the right moment, a person might feel the faint, wordless sense that who they have been all this time is somehow narrower than who they actually are. Not as a crisis, not with urgency, simply as a fact, arriving at an ordinary moment, a Tuesday perhaps, in the middle of the afternoon, with the light coming through a window at a particular angle, a fact that does not demand immediate action, but that once noticed cannot be entirely set aside. Jung had a name for what that feeling was pointing at. Two names, in fact, and the distinction between them is the beginning of everything he spent his life trying to understand. The first name is ego. The second is self. The ego, in Jung's careful accounting of the psyche, is the center of conscious awareness. It is the organizing function that allows a person to experience themselves as a continuous, coherent entity moving through time, the sense of being someone, of having memories that belong to this particular life, and intentions directed toward a particular future. The ego is real. Jung was clear about this. It is not an illusion to be dissolved or a limitation to be transcended. It is the necessary anchor of psychological life, the structure without which experience would have no center of gravity and thought would have no author. But the ego tends to make a very particular mistake. It tends to believe that because it is the center of conscious life, it is the center of all life, that the room it illuminates is the entire house. This is the confusion Jung identified, early and clearly, and with increasing certainty over the decades, as the root of a great deal of human suffering, not the dramatic suffering of crisis or catastrophe, but the quieter, more persistent suffering of a life lived too small, the suffering of a person who has organized their entire existence around a fragment of what they actually are without knowing that the fragment is a fragment. Imagine a lamp lit in a very large house at night. The lamp is real, its light is genuine. Within the room it occupies, everything is visible: the furniture, the walls, the books on the shelf, the window giving onto the dark garden. The lamp does not doubt its own light. It has no reason to. What it cannot know, from where it sits, is the extent of the house beyond the doorway. The hallway that leads from its room opens onto other rooms, and those rooms onto others, and the house is considerably larger than the lamp has yet illuminated. The rooms beyond its light are not empty. They are full of furniture and walls and the quiet, continuous fact of their own existence. They do not require the lamp's light in order to be real. They simply wait, patient and unpanicked, for the night to continue and the light to find its way further. The self, in Jung's framework, is the house. The ego is the lamp. This is not, as Jung was careful to clarify, a relationship of hierarchy or competition. The lamp does not need to be extinguished for the house to be appreciated. The ego does not need to be overcome for the self to be known. What changes when a person begins to understand this distinction is not the lamp, but the lamp's understanding of itself. The gradual, sometimes slow, always partial recognition that it is illuminating one room in something much larger than a room. The self, as Jung defined it, is not simply a bigger ego. It functions simultaneously as both the center and the circumference of the total personality. This is one of those formulations that sounds paradoxical until it is held for a while and then begins to feel simply accurate. The center and the circumference at once, the organizing core and the outermost boundary, the point from which everything radiates and the edge at which everything is contained. Jung was not being deliberately strange when he wrote this. He was trying to describe something he had encountered first in his clinical work, in the dreams and paintings and symbolic productions of his patients, and had then found confirmed to his ongoing interest in traditions and mythologies entirely remote from the consulting rooms of early 20th century Zurich. What he kept finding, wherever he looked, was the same shape: a circle, a center, something organized around a point that was also an edge. In the dreams of patients who had never opened a book on Eastern philosophy, the image would appear: a circle divided into 4 equal parts, a mandala, its symmetry both spontaneous and precise, as though the hand drawing it already knew the geometry before the mind had articulated it. In medieval Christian mysticism, the same structure appeared as the symbol of wholeness, the reconciled opposites, the divine ground beneath the created order. In Tibetan iconography, in Native American sand paintings, in the mathematical speculations of the alchemists who had occupied Jung's scholarly attention for decades, always the circle, always the center that was also a boundary. Jung did not believe this was a coincidence. He believed it was evidence. Evidence that the psyche, across all its cultural and historical variations, was reaching toward the same intuition, that something in human beings is organized around a center that is also a wholeness, and that this something is not a personal achievement, but a given fact of the psychic landscape, present before ego formation, and enduring beyond the ego's particular contents and concerns. He called this the self, and he identified it as the central archetype of the collective unconscious, the organizing principle around which all other archetypal patterns arrange themselves, the way planets arrange themselves around a gravitational center. The self constellates, it pulls, it draws the other structures of the psyche into relation with each other, not by force, but by a kind of deep attraction, an orientation toward wholeness, that the psyche seems to carry the way a plant carries its orientation toward light. The word archetype comes from the Greek arche, meaning first, original, and typos, meaning pattern or imprint. An archetype in Jung's use is a pattern in the deepest layer of the psyche, a structural tendency inherited not through personal experience, but as part of the shared endowment of being human. The self is the archetype of archetypes, not above the others in some hierarchy of importance, but prior to them, the ground from which they all arise, and toward which they all, in the movement of a full human life, eventually return. This was the territory into which Jung moved after that winter in 1913. The move was not smooth. The years immediately following the break with Freud were among the most disorienting of his life. Brad documented them in the journals and paintings and calligraphic texts that would eventually become the Red Book, a document he worked on for 16 years and did not publish in his lifetime. Each morning, during the most intense period of this inward confrontation, he would sit at his table and draw a circle. He didn't know at first what the circles meant or why he kept returning to them. He only knew that something in the drawing of them measured his psychological state in a way that no other diagnostic tool managed. The circles were his instrument for taking his own temperature. Each morning's mandala told him something about where he was, how the interior weather was settling, what was organizing itself, and what was still in motion. It was only years later, reading deeply in Eastern philosophy and medieval alchemy, that he recognized what his hand had been drawing toward. The mandala, the Sanskrit word for circle, was a traditional form for representing the same thing his unconscious had been trying to picture during those unsettled years: the center and the circumference, the totality that precedes and surrounds and exceeds every particular form the psyche takes, the self, rendered visible as shape. This is a point worth resting with for a moment. Jung was a trained physician and a scientist by formation. He did not arrive at these ideas from a position of mystical predisposition. He arrived at them empirically in the precise sense that matters to him through observation of psychic phenomena repeated across many patients and over many years, producing results consistent enough that he could not in good conscience dismiss them as idiosyncratic or coincidental. The symbols kept appearing. The mandalas kept arriving in the artwork of people who had no conscious knowledge of the tradition they were joining. The sense of an organizing center beneath the ego's operations kept asserting itself in clinical material and in his own interior work alike. He was not, he always insisted, making a metaphysical claim. He was making a psychological one. Whether the self corresponded to something beyond the psyche, whether it pointed toward a theological or cosmological reality, was a question he consistently declined to answer. He was a student of psychic images, he would say, not a theologian. What he could speak to was what the psyche produced, what it reached for, what it consistently returned to when left to its own organizational tendencies. And what it returned to, again and again, was the image of a center that was also a wholeness. The philosophical break with Freud had turned precisely on this question. Freud had built his understanding of the unconscious on the model of the repressed, the material that consciousness had rejected and pushed below the threshold of awareness, the drives and forbidden wishes that the psyche could not hold openly. The unconscious in Freud's framework was essentially a repository of what had been refused. Its contents were principally biographical, principally sexual, principally shaped by the specific history of the individual in relation to their early caregivers and the cultural prohibitions surrounding bodily life. Jung did not dispute the existence of this layer. He had seen it in clinical work and did not question its reality or its importance. What he disputed was the claim that this was all the unconscious was. The model felt too small to him, too local, too tied to the particulars of individual biography to account for what he kept encountering in the deeper layers of patient material, the imagery that did not seem to belong to any personal history, the symbols that arose from a depth below repression, from a place that had never been conscious in the first place, and therefore could not have been repressed. When Freud looked at the unconscious, he saw a basement. Jung looked at the same territory and saw something more like a continent, a vast, largely unmapped interior with its own geography and climate, and ancient inhabitants, only the topmost layer of which corresponded to Freud's repressed material. Below the personal, there was something impersonal. Below the individual, there was something collective. And at the very deepest level of this interior continent, there was something organizing it all, a center that was also a circumference, a principle of wholeness toward which the entire psychic landscape was, however slowly and however partially oriented. This was the decisive disagreement. It could not be bridged by further discussion or negotiation. It was a difference in what each man saw when he looked at the same evidence, and by 1913 both of them knew that the looking was incompatible. Jung's subsequent 48 years of work were in many ways an attempt to map the territory he had glimpsed beyond Freud's model, to bring back from the interior continent something that could be communicated, however imperfectly, to people who had not yet made the crossing. The concept he arrived at for this process of exploration was individuation. It is a word that sounds, at first hearing, like it might mean something simple, becoming an individual, perhaps, or developing a distinctive personality. But Jung meant something both more specific and more demanding. Individuation is the process by which a person becomes what they most essentially are, not what they decide to be, not what they improve themselves toward, what they already, in some deep structural sense, are, the blueprint that was present in the psyche before the ego had yet formed an opinion about it. The unique pattern of the whole personality seeking to realize itself through the particular life available to it. This is an important distinction. Individuation is not self-improvement. It does not involve adding capacities or cultivating virtues or achieving goals that the ego has selected from a list of appealing options. It involves, in Jung's understanding, a kind of surrender, not passive, not without effort, but a surrender to something that has been underway since before the ego was old enough to interfere. The self, as the organizing principle of the total personality, is always already at work. It does not wait for permission. It does not require the ego's cooperation, though cooperation makes the work proceed with less friction and less cost. It is moving quietly and persistently toward a wholeness that the ego cannot design and cannot fully understand, because the ego's understanding is by definition partial. This is why Jung called individuation a horizon rather than a destination. A destination is a place one arrives at. A horizon is always ahead, always the same distance from the traveler, not because the traveler isn't moving, but because the horizon moves with them. The self is inexhaustible in this sense. Whatever the ego manages to integrate and understand and receive, the self has more to offer, more depth, more breadth, more of the total personality waiting to be recognized and incorporated into conscious life. The process doesn't end. It doesn't culminate in a final achievement. It continues with the horizon always present, always unhurried, always at the same patient remove. There is something restful in this, when it is held rightly, The fact that individuation has no terminus means it cannot be failed by not having arrived somewhere. The fact that the self is always further ahead means there is no point at which a person has exhausted their own possibilities. The horizon is not a rebuke, it is an assurance that the territory is larger than the traveler, which is precisely what the traveler, if honest, has always suspected. The alchemists of the medieval and early modern periods spent centuries searching for what they called the philosopher's stone, a substance they believed capable of transforming base metals into gold, of healing illness, of conferring immortality. They rarely found it. In many cases, they bankrupted themselves and ruined their health in the search. But Jung, reading through the vast and frequently baffling literature they left behind, came to understand that the most interesting thing about the philosopher's stone was not the search, but the description. What the alchemists described when they described the stone, its nature, its location, the conditions under which it could be recognized, sounded, when translated from its symbolic register, remarkably like what Jung was trying to say about the self. The philosopher's stone, the alchemical texts insisted, was not manufactured. It was found. It was already present in the most common and overlooked of materials, the materia prima, the base stuff that the alchemist might walk past 100 times without noticing. The transformation it enabled was not a transformation of the world, but a transformation of the one who had learned to see it. And the seeing required not cleverness or ambition or the accumulation of technique, but a certain quality of attention, patient, humble, willing to sit with the ordinary material long enough that its hidden nature could begin to show. Jung read this and recognized what he was reading. The philosopher's stone was not a substance, it was a symbol. It was one of the psyche's most persistent and earnest attempts to picture in material terms something that belonged to the interior, the self, present from the beginning, hidden not in some remote or elevated place, but in the common material of ordinary human life, waiting not to be manufactured, but to be seen. The stone had another characteristic the alchemists never tired of noting. It was, they said, lapis exilis, the little stone, the humble stone, the stone so plain that one might mistake it for rubble. This was not an accident of description. It was an essential quality. The thing the psyche most needed was not spectacular or rare. It was already here. It had always been here. The difficulty was not acquiring it. The difficulty was learning to recognize it as what it was, in the midst of the very ordinary life one was already living. A person in midlife, pausing at an unremarkable moment, not in crisis, not at any particular threshold, but simply in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, with the sudden wordless sense that who they have been performing all these years is smaller than who they actually are. The sense arrives without drama. It does not insist on itself. It waits, patient as the stone in the alchemist's hand, for the quality of attention that can recognize it for what it is. This is the territory Jung spent his life in, not the territory of crisis and catastrophe, though those also played their role in the work he documented. The quieter territory, the territory of the ordinary day, in which something deeper than ordinary awareness makes itself briefly felt. The territory where the lamp in the room becomes for a moment aware of the house it is burning inside. Jung drew mandalas in the years after 1913 without yet fully knowing what they were. He knew they were measuring something. He knew that each morning's circle bore a relationship to his interior state, that a particular asymmetry in one day's drawing corresponded to a particular quality of unease, that a particular clarity in the following day's center corresponded to something settling. He was not trying to produce beautiful objects. He was trying to read himself, using the only instrument available that seemed accurate enough to be trusted. The instrument was the symbol, not the sign, not the kind of representation that points efficiently to something already agreed upon and moves along, but the living symbol, the kind of image that carries more meaning than can be stated directly, that opens onto a depth whose bottom cannot be seen from the surface. The mandala was this kind of image. It could not be translated into a proposition or summarized in a sentence without losing everything that made it useful. Its function was not to convey information, but to enact a relationship, the ego's relationship to the larger totality that the circle, by its very shape, was trying to picture. The circle, as a symbol, has properties that reward attention. It has no beginning and no end. Every point on its circumference is equidistant from the center. It is both the most regular and the most complete of shapes. It closes on itself without remainder, contains the maximum area for a given perimeter, has been understood in almost every mathematical and spiritual tradition as the form of wholeness, of completion, of something that lacks nothing, because it returns to itself. When the psyche reaches for a symbol of the self, Jung observed, it reaches for the circle, not because anyone has taught it to, because the circle already embodies what the self is trying to say. The mandala adds to the circle a center and a fourfold division, 4 quadrants, 4 directions, 4 chambers opening from a central point. Jung found this structure everywhere once he began looking for it, in the rose windows of Gothic cathedrals, in the cosmic diagrams of Hindu temples, in the sacred hoop of the Lakota, in the ground plans of ancient cities that organized their streets around a sacred center. Always the same architecture, always the center, and the 4, always the image of a totality that has a heart and a reach. He did not believe this was cultural transmission, though in some cases it was. He believed the structure was older than the transmission. He believed it arose from the psyche itself, from the same deep place from which the symbol of the self arose, because the psyche was trying to picture its own architecture, and this was the architecture it found when it looked. The mandala was not, for Jung, primarily a religious object or an artistic achievement or a meditative aid, though it could function as all of these. It was, most precisely, a self-portrait, not of the ego, but of the self. The psyche drawing what it was reaching toward, without instruction, without a model, because the model was already there, interior and waiting, at the center of what a person most essentially was. There is a photograph that was taken of Jung in his later years, sitting outside the stone tower he had built with his own hands on the shore of the lake at Bollingen. He is an old man in the photograph. His face has the quality of someone who has stopped being surprised by what they know. Not complacent, there is too much alertness in his eyes for complacency, but settled, at rest with something. The tower is visible behind him, built over decades in layers he added as he felt ready for them, each layer a further architectural expression of something he couldn't have built all at once. The tower was, he said, a confession of faith, not religious faith, but the faith of a man who had spent a long time working inward and had come to believe in the reality of what he found there. It was built without electricity, without a telephone, without the modern infrastructure of the life he lived elsewhere. At Bollingen, he cooked over an open fire and drew water from a well and worked with his hands in the garden, not as an affectation, as a practice, a way of remaining in contact with the material, the slow, the ordinary, the common stuff in which the stone he was looking for had always been quietly waiting. The self as Jung understood it after decades of work, is not located above or outside the ordinary life. It is not reached by transcending the mundane or escaping the ordinary into some elevated condition. It is present in the ordinary, as the depth the ordinary rests on. It is what makes the lamp's light possible, not by replacing the lamp, but by being the house in which the lamp is burning, the ground that the house stands on, the air that the burning requires. This is the quiet philosophical fact at the center of everything Jung spent his life trying to articulate. Not that the ego is wrong or insufficient or something to be overcome, but that the ego is a part, a real, necessary, illuminating part of something larger than it has yet been able to picture. The house extends beyond the doorway. The lake does not end at the near shore. The mandala's circumference is always further from the center than the center yet knows. A person lying in the ordinary stillness of an evening, not in crisis, not in need of resolution, not required to do anything about the question tonight, can simply rest in the philosophical possibility that the boundary of who they are extends further than the part of them that runs the day, that the center they experience as themselves sits inside a circumference they have not yet traveled to the edge of, that the self, as Jung understood it, is not a project but a presence, already here, already whole, in some deep structural sense, already organized around a center that is also a boundary, that is also, somewhere at its furthest reach, still their own. The lamp burns in its room. The house breathes around it in the dark. Both are real, both are steady, and the house, as it has always been, is considerably larger than the light that is currently visible from where the lamp stands. Not alarmingly, not urgently, but as a quiet fact that the night makes easier to hold. The way dark water holds light without being changed by it, the way the circle closes back on itself without needing to be drawn again, complete in a way that the pin that drew it can only point at, the circumference always a little further out than the hand that marked it, the wholeness always already present, patient and unhurried, holding the center in the way the house holds the lamp, in the way the dark holds the particular, necessary, genuine light of whatever small part of itself the night has asked a person to be. In the early 1900s, in a clinic on the outskirts of Zurich, a man sat across from Jung and described what he saw when he looked at the sun. There was a tube hanging from it, he said. When the wind blew, the tube moved, and that was where the wind came from. The man had no classical education. He had spent most of his adult life inside institutions. He could not have encountered, through any ordinary channel of reading or conversation, the Mithraic liturgy that Jung would later find in a text published years after this conversation took place, a text describing, in language close enough to make the breath catch, a tube suspended from the solar disk, a generator of divine wind. Jung sat very still. Something had produced this image, and it had not been memory. It had not been reading or travel or the ordinary accumulation of a life's experience. Whatever had made it was older than the man sitting across from him, and older than the room they were sitting in, and older, perhaps, than the particular civilization whose language they shared. That moment stayed with Jung for the rest of his career, not as a proof of anything exactly, but as a datum, a piece of stubborn, irrepressible evidence that the psyche contained more than one person's life could account for. The model he developed over the following decades to explain what he had witnessed that morning was not a simple one. It had layers. It had a near surface and a far depth, and the depth did not stop where it could still be called personal. Most psychological thinking before Jung, and much of it after, confined itself to the shallow geography, the experiences a person could remember if they looked carefully, the conflicts they had learned not to name, the wishes they had been trained to suppress. Jung took all of that seriously. He did not dismiss the near surface, but he spent the larger part of his intellectual life looking past it towards something that required a different kind of map. The near layer has a name in his system: the personal unconscious. It is built up across a lifetime, layer by layer, the way sediment builds at the bottom of a river. Forgotten things settle there, experiences that did not fit the life being consciously lived, memories that carried too much charge to remain in ordinary awareness, feelings that were never allowed to complete their motion, and so went underground instead. None of this material disappears. It only becomes unavailable to ordinary inspection. It waits in the silt organized around cores of emotional intensity that Jung called complexes, and from time to time it rises. A complex is not quite a thought, and not quite a feeling. It is more like a small weather system, a cluster of associations gathered around an emotional center, capable of generating its own atmosphere and temporarily altering everything in range. The complex around a person's relationship with authority, for instance, does not limit itself to moments when authority is actually present. It reaches into situations that merely resemble those moments, projecting the old emotional charge onto new circumstances, briefly making the present indistinguishable from a particular past. People notice this afterward. If they are honest, they notice that they reacted to a situation with an intensity that the situation alone could not explain. They notice that something else arrived with them into the room. Jung described complexes, in one of his more precise formulations, as splinter personalities. That phrase is worth holding for a moment. Not a flaw, not a wound, a splinter personality. Something with its own perspective, its own logic, its own relationship to the world. When a complex is activated, it does not simply color the thinking. For a short time, it runs it. The ego, that carefully maintained center of ordinary self-awareness, steps back without knowing it has done so, and the complex steps forward wearing its face. The argument that escalates further than anyone intended, the moment of inexplicable shyness in someone who is otherwise perfectly at ease, the grip of a grief that arrives years after the loss and refuses the proportion of the occasion. These are the visible signs of something that lives in the personal unconscious and has not yet been met with sufficient awareness to stop needing quite so much room. The personal unconscious is particular to the person who carries it. Two people who grew up in the same house, sleeping in adjacent rooms, will have formed different complexes around the same material, because what shapes the personal unconscious is not just what happened, but how a given temperament responded to it. This layer is genuinely private in a way the deeper layer is not. Below the personal unconscious, in Jung's map, something else begins. Not the residue of a life, nothing that could in principle have been remembered, nothing that was ever conscious and later forgotten. A different kind of substrate altogether. Jung named it the collective unconscious, and the name is accurate in both directions. It is collective because it is not formed by any individual experience and is not particular to any individual person. It is unconscious because, like the deeper layers of the ocean, it does not ordinarily come to the surface of awareness, and when it does so in forms that consciousness finds strange, even overwhelming, because they carry more energy than a single life has been built to hold. The collective unconscious is not inherited in the way a language or a cultural tradition is inherited, passed down through teaching, through imitation, through the explicit transmission of one generation to the next. It is inherited the way the capacity for language is inherited, as a structural readiness, a set of potentials built into the organism, waiting to be activated by experience rather than implanted through it. Every infant arrives in the world already capable of acquiring language, not any specific language, but the capacity for language as such. Jung argued that something comparable is true of the psyche's deepest layer. Every person arrives already structured to respond to certain kinds of experience with certain kinds of imagery. The mother is not merely the woman who gave birth to a particular person. She is also an archetype, a shape the psyche already contains the matrix of, a pattern of relationship and feeling that the personal experience of one's own mother activates and colors, but does not create from nothing. The distinction matters. It matters because it explains something that a purely personal psychology cannot explain. Why the symbolism that emerges from the dreams of a Swiss psychiatric patient in 1906 can look so much like the cosmology inscribed in a temple built in Egypt 3,000 years earlier. If the images arose only from personal experience, the overlap would have no explanation. If they arise from a shared psychic substrate, from structural patterns that are the inheritance of every human being simply by virtue of being human, then the overlap is exactly what should be expected. Those structural patterns are archetypes. The word has migrated so far into ordinary speech that it needs to be held carefully here, given its original weight and precision. An archetype, in Jung's technical sense, is not an image. This is the point most often missed, and it is the most important point about the entire concept. The archetype itself is imageless. It is a structural tendency, a pattern of response built into the psychic organism, predisposing it to experience certain kinds of situations: birth, death, the encounter with power, the meeting with a stranger, the bond between parent and child, in certain kinds of ways. The archetype in itself cannot be seen. It has no specific form. Like a magnetic field, it has no appearance. It can only be known through what it does to things within its range. What it does when experience activates it is produce an image. Not one fixed image. The archetype is too deep for that, too prior to any particular culture's specific vocabulary of form. It produces instead a family of images, related, recognizable across cultures, bearing a family resemblance that can be traced no matter how far apart their points of origin stand. The Great Mother archetype does not always appear as the same figure. She is the gentle and nourishing mother of some traditions and the devouring, consuming darkness of others. She is the goddess and the witch, the earth that feeds and the earth that swallows. The archetype beneath both images is the same, the pattern of the containing, encompassing, life-giving, and life-taking feminine, but the cultural form it takes depends on where and when and through whose inner life it has passed. Jung was careful to separate these two things his whole career. The archetype itself, unknowable without form, prior to any image, known only through its effects on the imagery and behavior it produces. The archetypal image, the specific shape the archetype takes when it crosses the threshold into consciousness, always culturally shaped, always particular, always in some sense a translation of something that resists being fully translated. The difference between them is something like the difference between a gravitational field and the orbit it produces. The orbit can be seen and measured and mapped. The gravity that made it can only be inferred from the curve, from the pull, from the steadiness with which everything in range maintains its particular path. This layer of the psyche, this shared impersonal structural depth, is where the figures live that appear unbidden in dreams and in the most intense experiences of psychological life. The shadow, the anima, the animus, The wise old man, the great mother, the trickster, these are not characters invented by mythology departments or the committees of organized religion. They are the forms the collective unconscious has reliably produced across cultures that had no knowledge of each other, because they are the forms the deep structure of human experience reliably takes when it is given room to express itself. The shadow is one of these figures, and of all of them, it is perhaps the one most likely to make an appearance in the life of ordinary self examination. Every personality is built through choice, or what feels like choice, and what functions as choice, whether or not it is. From the earliest formation of a sense of self, certain qualities are selected and others are passed over. The child who is praised for being patient and calm may gradually let the parts of herself that are impatient and stormy go unattended, not through any dramatic act of suppression, but through 1,000 small redirections, each barely perceptible. The capacities that were not developed do not disappear. They gather, over time, into the shadow, the collection of traits, impulses, and potentials the ego has declined to incorporate into its picture of itself. The shadow is not simply the bad. That is the first thing to correct about the popular use of the word. It contains whatever was refused, and some of what was refused was genuinely inferior, genuinely difficult, genuinely worthy of the social training that discouraged it. But some of what was refused was merely inconvenient, or was refused because it did not fit the identity that circumstances happened to reward. The man who spent 40 years being reliable and measured and professionally effective may find in his shadow a wild playfulness that he cannot quite account for, a longing for disorder and color that no one would have predicted from the outside. The woman who organized her life around the demands of others may find there a vast, unrealized ambition that has been waiting without diminishing, gathering force from neglect. Jung was insistent on this point across many decades and many clinical encounters. The shadow is not simply a moral problem to be solved. It is also an untapped resource. Its contents are not all dark, they are all unintegrated, which is different. The energy the shadow holds is real energy. The life the shadow contains is real life. To become acquainted with what lives there is not to become worse, but in many cases, to become for the first time somewhat more complete. The encounter with the shadow in clinical work and in serious self-examination tends to have a particular quality. It arrives as something recognized from the outside before it is recognized from the inside, seen most easily in other people, in the qualities that produce in an observer a response disproportionate to what the situation requires. The person whose failings provoke in us not ordinary irritation, but something more heated, more personal, more uncomfortable, this is one of the shadow's reliable signals. What is most forcefully refused shows most clearly in projection. The shadow cast by a person's self-image falls not inward, where it would be visible, but outward onto the figures of the world, where it can be engaged without being owned. Sitting alongside the shadow in the architecture of the collective unconscious are the figures Jung called the anima and the animus. These are the contrasexual dimensions of the psyche, the feminine presence within the male psyche, the masculine presence within the female, each constituting not an aberration, but a deep structural reality, a kind of inner other that has been present since before consciousness began its work of division. The anima, in Jung's detailed account of her, is not a simple figure. She has a range that moves from the purely biological, the way all male organisms carry female hormones alongside their dominant hormonal register, through the psychological and up into something very close to what spiritual traditions have called the soul. She is the figure through which a man is capable of relation, of intuition, of the kind of felt understanding that does not proceed from analysis, but from a different kind of knowing altogether. She is the figure who appears in dreams with a particular numinosity, carrying a quality of meaning that ordinary figures do not carry. And she appears first, almost always, in projection. The anima does not arrive early in a life as an interior recognition. She arrives as an exterior encounter. The woman met at a party whose pull defies proportion. The figure on a screen or a page who seems to carry something entirely personal, though nothing personal has been shared. The intensity of feeling that concentrates around this figure is the first indication that something larger than personal attraction is in motion. The anima, catching sight in the outer world of something that resembles her own face, responds with the full force of an interior figure who has been waiting a long time to be seen. The animus in the female psyche is structured differently, but follows a comparable logic. Where the anima tends toward the personal, the atmospheric, the relational, the animus tends toward the impersonal, the systematic, the declarative. He is the figure through whom a woman accesses conviction, direction, the kind of organizing force that moves through the world with a certain purposeful weight. In projection, he appears as the man who carries an air of authority that makes no ordinary sense, the intellectual whose certainty feels personal, the figure onto whom something is placed that properly belongs inside. The withdrawal of these projections, the long, careful work of recognizing the anima and animus as interior figures rather than exterior facts, is one of the most demanding aspects of the psychological work Jung described. Not because the projections are difficult to identify, exactly, but because they carry such genuine feeling. The projection of the anima, in particular, carries what feels like love, and it does carry love, the love one part of the psyche has for the wholeness it contains, but has not yet consciously inhabited. To withdraw the projection is not to lose the feeling, it is to redirect it inward toward its actual source. What makes this possible to hold intellectually, even in the middle of the night, is the recognition that the collective unconscious is not a chamber of horrors. It is a deep reservoir of human experience, the accumulated psychic wisdom of every generation that preceded this one, carried not as memory, but as structure, as the innate capacity to respond to certain kinds of experience in certain kinds of ways. The figures who inhabit it are not alien. They are, in a sense, the most intimate things in the psyche, more intimate than the memories of the personal life, more intimate even than the carefully maintained structures of the ego, because they were there before any of that architecture was built. Jung's clinical patients produced them spontaneously. The people who came to him in states of psychological difficulty were not for the most part scholars of mythology. They had not studied the great serpent traditions of the ancient world, had not read the Norse cosmologies or the Egyptian funerary texts or the mystery cult records of the Hellenistic era, but their dreams contained the serpent. Their psychotic episodes produce the imagery of cosmic dismemberment and renewal that appears in cultures with no shared textual tradition. Two patients in the same week might produce imagery so similar to each other, and so similar to something in a Sumerian cylinder seal or a Pueblo sand painting, that the only honest response was to stop explaining and start describing. Jung was a careful empiricist about this. He did not leap from the evidence to metaphysical conclusions. He did not claim that the collective unconscious proved the existence of a world soul or a cosmic mind, or the literal transmission of psychic content across generations. He claimed only what the evidence seemed to require, that the psyche had depths that could not be accounted for by the individual life history, and that those depths produced imagery so consistent across time and culture that the simplest explanation was a shared structural endowment rather than coincidence. The image that has stayed in the literature, partly because Jung himself returned to it, is that of patients with no classical education spontaneously producing mythological content, not fragments or vague resemblances, specific motifs, the hero descending into the earth, the encounter with the serpent, the ritual death and return, reproduced in the contemporary patient's dream, with a precision that matched not the popular culture of the period, but the texts of antiquity that the patient had no way of having read. The unconscious, it seemed, had been reading books that no one had given it, two cultures on opposite sides of the earth, with no recorded contact, each telling the story of descent and transformation in forms so structurally similar that the parallels persist across translation. This is the kind of datum that Jung spent his career learning to sit with rather than explain away. The shared story is not an accident of cultural exchange. It is a result of shared psychic structure, the way every human organism, presented with certain fundamental life experiences, the overwhelming darkness, the confrontation with something that exceeds the ego's capacity, the slow return to the light, produces the same symbolic response. The descent is not a cultural invention. It is the psyche's natural language for a certain kind of interior experience, and it arises wherever that experience arises. The collective unconscious does not exhaust itself in the content of any single culture's mythology. It is older than any mythology. The mythologies themselves are its products, the attempts of conscious collective life to give permanent transmissible form to the imagery that the deep layer of the psyche reliably produces. The myths are, as it were, the traces left by the collective unconscious in cultural memory, the way the marks left on a beach are traces of water that has since withdrawn. The water is more primary than the marks. The archetype is more primary than the myth that carries its image. This is a distinction that takes a while to settle into, but it is one of the most peaceful distinctions in the whole of Jung's psychology. The myth is not the truth. The myth is the form the truth has taken in one particular cultural moment, filtered through one particular civilization's vocabulary of image and story. The truth beneath it, the archetype, the structural pattern, the deep psychic tendency, is neither one culture's property nor any other's. It belongs to the species. It was present before any culture gave it its particular form, and it will persist, taking new forms long after the mythologies that carry it now have been replaced by others. There is something genuinely calming about this idea, properly held. The images that rise in a dream, the figures that appear unbidden in the imagination, the inexplicable sense of familiarity that certain stories carry, these are not random. They are not the noise of a malfunctioning mind or the arbitrary firing of neurons with nowhere useful to go. They are the collective unconscious expressing, through the personal life, the patterns it has always expressed, the patterns it was built to express, the patterns that every human being who has ever lived has been built to recognize when they arrive. The archetype of the wise elder arrives in different clothing across every tradition that has lasted long enough to develop clothing for it. The figure who knows more than can be easily explained, whose knowledge comes from a depth the ordinary transactions of life do not reach, who appears at the moment of genuine need and not before. This figure is not an invention of any single culture. It is the psyche's image of its own deeper resources, projected onto the figure of an elder, because the elder, in human experience, is the most accessible available symbol for knowledge that has required time, the knowledge that cannot be hurried into existence, but only waited for. The trickster archetype, present in virtually every mythological tradition on Earth, is the figure who breaks the rules that the community has agreed are unbreakable, not to destroy them, but to reveal that they were, all along, conventions rather than necessities. The trickster brings chaos, but also creation. In Norse mythology, he is Loki. In the traditions of the American Southwest, he is Coyote. In the Greek world, he is Hermes, who moves between the living and the dead, carrying messages that neither side could deliver without him. Each of these figures is different in the specific texture of their stories. Each of them is, at the structural level, the same pattern, the one who slips between categories, who refuses the fixed positions, who makes things move when movement has become impossible through ordinary means. The persistence of this figure across traditions that developed independently of each other is exactly the kind of evidence Jung was collecting his whole career. Not as proof, he was too careful for proof, but as illustration of a principle. The collective unconscious does not produce random imagery. It produces specific families of imagery, reliably across the full range of human cultural expression, because the patterns that generate those families are structural features of the human psyche itself. And below even the archetypal images, below the specific figures who wear the faces mythology has given them, below every image the unconscious has ever produced, the archetypes themselves, in their naked form, without clothing, without the face that any particular culture has given them, not things that can be described, because description is already a form of clothing, already the beginning of the archetypal image, rather than the archetype itself. The archetype in its pure structural state is something the mind cannot look at directly, for the same reason that no eye can see light itself, only what light falls on. The word moon names something that can be pointed to, painted, described in a poem, associated with tide tables and calendar cycles, and the particular quality of light on a clear autumn night. The gravitational field that makes the tides move, that holds the oceans to their seasonal rhythm, that has been pulling at everything within its range since before there were eyes to see it, that cannot be pointed to. It can only be known through what it moves. The archetype is like that. The gravitational field, not the moon. The tidal force, not the tide. This is the honest limit of the concept, and Jung knew it was a limit. He spent decades trying to describe something that by definition resists description, the structural patterns beneath the imagery, the patterns that generate the imagery without being identical to it. He came back again and again to the analogy of an axis, the archetype as an invisible axis around which a family of images clusters and rotates, the axis itself never appearing, but discoverable through the arrangement of everything that circles it. The axis does not need to appear. Its presence is demonstrated by the fact that the images move together in their particular way, and not in any other. The man in the clinic who saw the tube in the sun was not reporting a memory. He was reporting the emergence of something from that invisible axis, a fragment of the collective unconscious surfacing through the breaks in ordinary awareness that psychic distress can open, producing in his particular mind, in his particular language, the image that corresponded to what others, long before him and far away from him, had produced in theirs. Jung sat across from him and received it with the seriousness it deserved, not as a symptom only, as evidence of a depth. That depth does not announce itself in ordinary life. It does not require a psychiatric break to become accessible, though that is one of the routes by which it becomes undeniably present, or moves in quieter ways, in the dream that carries more weight than dreams usually carry, in the figure from a story who refuses to leave the imagination long after the story is over, in the sudden arrested attention of a child hearing a fairy tale for the first time. The child who has never heard this particular tale and yet receives it with a recognition that is almost like memory. Something in the child knows the structure. Something in the child has always known it, has been carrying the matrix of it since before any specific story gave it form. The collective unconscious requires no preparation and no study. It only requires the ordinary conditions of a human life. Because the ordinary conditions of a human life, birth and fear and love and loss and the encounter with limits, and the recurring sense of something not quite visible, just beyond the edge of the knowable, are exactly the conditions the deep layer of the psyche was built to respond to. It has been responding to them in every human being who has ever lived, since long before the word psychology existed, since long before there were words for any of this at all. The archetype moves through all of it, through the clinical record and the mythological text, and the spontaneous drawing and the dream that arrives without invitation, through the child's recognition and the elder's remembering and the philosopher's long attempt to name the unnamed, through every tradition that has tried to give this depth a language, and every tradition that will come after, trying again. The archetype itself remains, imageless, prior to every image, known only by what it moves, the way gravity is known only by the curve of everything within its field. Not seen directly, not needing to be seen, present, the way deep forces are present, steadily, without demonstration, doing their work regardless of whether the thing at the surface has yet found the language to say what is holding it. Jung was in his 60s when he began to understand what the tower at Bollingen was actually for. He had acquired the land on the upper shore of Lake Zurich in 1922, a parcel of ground at the edge of the water, and he had built the first stone structure there with his own hands, quarrying and shaping the blocks himself, refusing any assistance from machinery or hired labor. The work was slow. He intended it to be slow. Each stone placed by hand took as long as it took, and in that slowness, something was happening that he did not have a word for yet. He would sit outside in the early morning before any visitors had arrived, a cup of something warm held in both hands, the lake completely still before him, the air carrying the particular quiet of water in the hours before the wind arrives to remind it of its own surface. He was a man who had stopped arguing with the direction his life had taken, not because the argument had been won, but because the arguing, at some point in the decades before this morning, had ceased to feel like the point. The tower grew over the years the way certain things grow, not all at once, not according to a plan completed before the building began, but in response to something that kept arriving with new demands. Jung added to it in 1927, and again in 1931, and again in 1955, each addition corresponding to a different phase of his interior life, a different stage of what he had come to understand as the primary work of a human existence, not the work of achievement or of social standing, not the work of developing a theory, though theories had come, were the work of becoming, slowly and without guarantee, the particular person one had always most essentially been. He had a name for this work. He called it individuation, and what he meant by it took most of a lifetime to say. To understand what Jung was pointing at, it helps to stand at the beginning of a life and observe how it builds itself. In the first decades, a person is largely engaged in construction. The ego must be formed, a stable center of conscious will, a reliable narrator for the continuous experience of being someone in particular. The social world presses its requirements, and a person responds to those requirements by becoming legible, by developing what Jung called the persona, the face presented to the collective, the version of oneself that can hold a job and maintain a friendship and navigate the expectations that a culture presses on every individual who intends to belong to it. This construction is genuine and necessary. Jung did not regard it as a mistake or a betrayal. The persona is a real achievement, and the ego that operates behind it is a genuinely important structure. Without a stable ego, there is no platform from which to encounter anything else. Without a functional persona, the business of living among other people becomes impossibly costly. The first half of life, built around these formations, accomplishes something real. The life established has actual weight, actual value, actual meaning, and then, somewhere in the middle of it, something begins to shift. The shift does not always announce itself dramatically. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the middle of an ordinary week, in the gap between one task and the next. A person who has been moving with purpose through a life that appeared to be going well finds themselves standing still for a moment that lasts longer than it should. Something in them has gone quiet in a way that is different from tiredness. The tiredness is familiar. This is something else. This is the tiredness not of having done too much, but of having been, for a long time, someone slightly smaller than themselves. Jung had observed this pattern in his clinical practice across decades. The people who arrived at his consulting room in Kusnacht were not always in obvious crisis. Many of them had built successful lives by any reasonable external measure. They had the careers and the marriages and the homes and the social standing that the first half of life is organized around acquiring. What they did not have was the sense that these things added up to who they actually were. Something in them had been waiting for a conversation that had not begun yet. Something had been patient for a long time and was becoming, quietly, less so. He was struck by the regularity of this. The midlife passage, he came to understand, was not an accident or a failure of nerve. It was structurally built into a human life. The values and strategies that had organized the first half were not wrong, they had been right for what they were for. But the second half of a life asks something different. The first half turns outward toward the world and its requirements. The second half turns inward toward a different set of requirements entirely. Requirements that do not come from the culture, but from something in the depths of the psyche that has its own agenda and has been waiting its turn with considerable patience. What begins to speak in the middle of a life is what Jung identified as the self, not the ego, which is the part of the psyche that has been running things until now, managing the persona and directing the will and maintaining the story of who this person is. The self is older than the ego and broader than it, carrying the full compass of what a person is capable of being, rather than just the capacities that have so far been expressed. Where the ego is the part of the personality that has been lit and lived in, the self encompasses the unlit rooms as well, the territories of character and longing and capacity that have not yet found their way into the ongoing story of a life. When the self begins to speak, it rarely begins with arguments. It does not address the ego directly and explain its position. It speaks instead in the language it has always preferred, in dreams that leave a residue behind them through the following day, in a persistent sense that some theme is being lived around rather than lived, in the kind of emotion that arrives without clear cause and seems to be pointing at something the mind has not yet managed to name. Jung called this inner pressure the daemon, borrowing a concept from the ancient Greeks who had used the word to describe a guiding spirit, a force that moves a person toward their distinctive form rather than away from it. The daemon is not dramatic. It does not insist urgently. It returns. Year after year, it returns to the same territory, the same unlived theme, with the steadiness of something that has decided to be patient because it has already waited this long and it knows it will eventually be heard. A woman in her mid-40s who had spent 20 years building a professional identity realizes that the identity, solid as it is, does not encompass the painter she was at 22 or the person who used to walk for hours along the edge of water, thinking about nothing in particular. The painting and the walking are not simply things she no longer has time for. They are the daemon's return address, the coordinates to which something in her keeps sending letters that she has been too busy to open. A man in his late 30s who has pursued ambition with genuine commitment finds that the ambition achieved does not produce what he expected, and that what he actually wants keeps appearing at the edge of his vision in a form he cannot quite make out. Not another achievement, not a louder version of what he already has, but something with a different quality entirely, something that has to do with depth rather than height. These are not unique stories. They are, in Jung's understanding, essentially the same story, told by different people in different settings, because the arc that contains them is not personal but structural, a feature of what it means to be a human psyche moving through time. The movement toward the self that characterizes the second half of life requires, among other things, a gradual and often uncomfortable reassessment of the persona. The persona, which served so well in the first half, began as a tool and can, over time, fuse itself to the wearer's sense of identity in ways that are difficult to detect from the inside. The face presented to the world stops feeling like a presentation and starts feeling like the whole face, the version of oneself that others have responded to and confirmed begins to feel like the only version there is, because it has received so much confirming attention, and the other versions have received so little. Individuation asks that this fusion be loosened, not that the persona be abandoned. A person who abandons their persona without replacing it with something more authentic has not individuated. They have simply become incoherent. The work is more careful than abandonment. It is closer to the slow uncovering of a face that was always there beneath the surface, a face that the mask has been protecting without knowing it, until the day arrives when the protection is no longer what is needed. Jung had felt this himself, and with an intensity that few of his patients could match. His break with Freud in the years surrounding 1912 had cost him not only a friendship and a professional alliance, but the entire theoretical scaffolding that had given his work its public shape. He had dismantled the most visible structure of his intellectual persona and had found himself standing in what he later described as a period of intense disorientation, a darkness that was not merely emotional, but epistemological, a genuine not knowing about what he was and what his work was actually for. He had responded not by immediately constructing a new theoretical framework, but by turning inward, by following the images that arrived in dreams and waking visions with the same careful attention he had given to his patient's material, treating his own interior as the territory that needed to be mapped. The mandalas came from this period. Each morning, he would sit down and draw a circle, divide it into 4 sections, fill it with whatever shapes and colors arrived from somewhere below, the intention to make a particular thing. He did not know what they were at first. He only knew that the day seemed to go differently on the mornings when he had drawn one, that something in him felt steadier afterward, more located, as though the circle had given the interior confusion a temporary geometry. It was only much later, encountering mandalas in Asian religious traditions and in the spontaneous artwork of patients who had never seen a mandala in any conscious context, that he understood what he had been doing. He had been drawing the self, not describing it, not theorizing about it, drawing it every morning as a way of reminding the center where it was. The concept he eventually built around these experiences he called the conunction. He borrowed the word from the language of medieval alchemy, where it described the marriage of opposing substances in the vessel, the union of sulfur and mercury, of solar and lunar principles, of the fixed and the volatile. For the alchemists, the conunction was the culminating event of the great work, the transformation that preceded the production of the philosopher's stone. Jung read their imagery as the unconscious had provided it, as a picture of an interior event, a psychological reality rendered in the coded language of an age that did not yet have the vocabulary to speak of such things directly. What the alchemical conunction described in Jung's reading was the relationship toward which the long work of individuation moves, not a merging of the ego and the self, which would mean the dissolution of conscious personality into the depths that contain it, not the ego's domination of the self, which is where many people begin and which produces the peculiar suffering of a life lived entirely on the surface. Something more particular than either, a conscious relationship. An ongoing conversation between the ego's directed will and the self's deeper knowledge, neither one subordinate to the other, each carrying what the other cannot, the tension between them generative rather than destructive. This is what the alchemical images show when they are read carefully. Two figures standing within the same circle, one solar and one lunar, one carrying the quality of directed intention, and one carrying the quality of receptive depth, not merged, not separated, in conversation, in tension, why in the slow mutual recognition that is the most honest description of what psychological wholeness actually looks like from the inside, not a state of finished harmony, but a live relationship between parts of the self that have not always known each other, managed with some degree of consciousness, continuing across years, mostly quiet and mostly in the dark. The tower at Bollingen was Jung's most literal attempt to make this visible. He had built it with his own hands, quarrying stone from the lakeshore, refusing the speed and efficiency of machinery that would have made the structure rise faster and cost him less in labor. The slowness was not stubbornness, it was the method. Each stone placed by hand required the full attention of the body, the collaboration of muscle and balance, and the particular knowledge of weight that comes only from lifting actual things. There was no way to be abstract while setting a stone. The work pulled him entirely into the present moment, into the relationship between his hands and the material, and this pulling was what he was after. The tower was built the way the self is built, not according to a completed blueprint, not all at once, not with the most efficient tools, but through sustained attention to what is actually there, what actually fits, what the existing structure asks for next. He added to the tower across 4 decades. Each addition corresponded to something that had changed or deepened in his interior life. Some new territory mapped, some aspect of the self made available to consciousness that had not been available before. The finished structure, which was never quite finished, because Jung kept discovering that it needed something more, was a building that had grown along with the person building it. It was not a monument, it was a record of a process. This is what individuation looks like from the outside, on the occasions when it leaves visible traces, not a transformation achieved at a particular moment, not an arrival at a final condition, a record of a process slowly accumulated, full of revisions and additions, carrying in its overall shape something that no single moment within it could fully contain. For the people who came to Jung's consulting room in the second half of their lives, the work was rarely dramatic in the early stages. It began with small things, a dream that refused to be dismissed in the morning, a moment of emotion that arrived without explanation and pointed dimly toward territory that had not been entered yet. A recurring theme in the stories they kept telling about their own lives, the same figure appearing under different names, the same kind of choice presenting itself again and again, as though the psyche were asking a question it had not yet received an adequate answer to. Jung's role in this work was not to interpret these materials for the patient, but to accompany the patient into relationship with them. The difference is important. Interpretation can be done from a position of distance by someone who has read the relevant literature and can locate a symbol in its traditional context. Accompaniment requires something else, a willingness to sit with the material without immediately resolving it, to allow the image to do its work before the explanation arrives, to trust that the psyche knows more about what it needs than the analyst does. This trust was grounded in Jung's understanding of the self as an autonomous organizing principle. The self is not a concept the ego constructs in order to make sense of its experience. It is prior to the ego and operates independently of the ego's intentions, guiding the psyche toward configurations of meaning and wholeness that the ego, left entirely to its own devices, would never have found or sought. The ego's job in the second half of life is not to lead, but to attend, to notice what the self is already doing and to cooperate with it, to bring the full resources of conscious awareness into the service of a process that does not originate in consciousness. This requires, among other things, a particular kind of humility, not the humility of self-deprecation or the performance of inadequacy. The specific humility of a person who has recognized that the part of themselves that has been doing all the planning is genuinely not the whole of what they are, and that the whole has things to teach the part, things that the part cannot learn by thinking harder or achieving more. Jung had his own difficulties with this humility. His capacity for intellectual construction was enormous, and the temptation to organize the materials of the unconscious into theoretical systems was one he felt continuously. He was not immune to the inflation that threatens any person who begins to feel they have a special access to the depths. He wrote about this honestly in his autobiography, describing the periods of his own process when the ego had assumed too much authority over materials that asked for a different kind of attention. The tower was partly his answer to this temptation. When the hands are occupied with stone, the intellect does not run as far ahead of the experience as it might otherwise wish to. What the second half of life asks of a person is not simply the abandonment of what the first half built. The persona is not discarded. The ego does not dissolve. The achievements of the first 40 years do not cease to be real or valuable. What changes is the relationship of all these things to each other and to the deeper ground from which they arose. The persona becomes again what it was at the beginning, a tool, a functional form, something worn consciously rather than identified with absolutely. The ego continues to operate, continues to direct will and maintain narrative coherence, but operates now with some awareness that it is not the source of everything, that there is a larger organization at work around it and beneath it, that it serves rather than commands. This does not happen quickly. It does not happen all at once. It happens the way the tower happened, in stages, over years, each stage building on what was established before it, each stone placed in the context of all the stones that preceded it, the overall form emerging gradually from the accumulation of sustained attention and patient labor. Jung understood that most people would not pursue this work in any conscious or systematic way. Most people live the second half of their lives much as they lived the first, carrying the same persona, organized around the same values, doing with somewhat less energy what they had been doing with more. There is no condemnation in Jung's recognition of this. The psyche does not demand individuation the way a creditor demands payment. What it does is make its preferences known through the language of dreams and symptoms and the recurring themes that will not stay dismissed. Whether those preferences are followed is a matter of individual circumstance and individual willingness, and Jung was too honest about the difficulty of the work to suggest that the willingness is easy to summon. What he did insist on was the possibility. At any age, at any point in a life, however far the persona has fused to the face, or the ego has forgotten the territory beyond its own perimeter, the self continues to operate. It continues to send its communications. The dreams continue. The daemon continues its patient return to the unlived theme. The possibility of entering into conscious relationship with what has been there all along does not close. It simply waits. There is something in this waiting that is worth pausing with. The self does not tire. It does not grow impatient in the way a person grows impatient, demanding response on a human timetable. It operates on a different scale of time than the ego does, a scale large enough to encompass the full arc of a life, rather than the pressures of the present month. This is part of what makes dreams feel the way they feel, slightly outside the clock, slightly unconcerned with the urgency of whatever the dreamer was anxious about the evening before, oriented instead towards something larger and slower that the waking mind finds it difficult to hold for long after waking. Jung at Bollingen, in the mornings before visitors arrived, with the lake still and the air carrying whatever the season had brought to it, was a man living as close to that scale as his circumstances allowed. The tower had become, over the decades of its construction, a place where the gap between the ego's timetable and the self's timetable was somewhat smaller than it was in Zurich, in the consulting room, in the academic and professional life that continued through everything. At Bollingen there were no appointments until the day required them. The stone was there, the water was there, the long work of becoming himself, which had been underway since before he could remember, was there, and it was patient, and it did not need him to hurry. The people who arrived at his consulting room, carrying their midlife exhaustion, not the exhaustion of overwork, but the exhaustion of a life slightly misaligned with what it most wanted to be, were at the beginning of something rather than the end of it. The disorientation they felt, the sense that the compass had stopped pointing in a direction that made sense, was not a breakdown, it was a recalibration. The psyche was adjusting its orientation from the demands of the first half of life toward the demands of the second, and the adjustment before it settled produced the particular kind of confusion that comes from being between two orientations rather than fully inside either one. What helped Jung found was not the reassurance that everything would resolve quickly, or that the disorientation was temporary in the way a difficult week is temporary. What helped was the recognition that the disorientation had a meaning, that it was pointing towards something, that the loss of the old compass was not the end of direction, but the beginning of a different kind of direction, slower, deeper, less legible from the outside, oriented toward an inner truth rather than an outer achievement. This recognition did not produce immediate ease, but it produced something more durable than ease, the sense that what was happening had a shape, that the confusion was not random, that somewhere beneath the confusion, the self was continuing its organizing work, drawing the psyche toward configurations of wholeness, that the ego, standing in the middle of its own disorientation, could not yet see. The shape is not visible all at once. That is part of what makes the middle of the passage difficult. A person standing in the middle of the second half of their own life, in the middle of the recalibration, cannot see the overall form that is slowly emerging. They can only see the stone directly in front of them, the particular piece of work the present moment requires. This is not a flaw in the arrangement, it is the arrangement. Individuation cannot be grasped from outside itself, any more than a dream can be fully understood before it finishes dreaming. What can be known from within the process is that it is continuing. The dreams continue, the daemon continues its return. The self continues to send its communications through whatever channels the ego has left open to receive them. And the tower, stone by stone, continues to rise, not toward a finished state, but toward the next thing it needs, and then the thing after that, and then the thing after that. Jung died in 1961 at his house in Kusnacht, having spent 60 years building something that had no single moment of completion. The tower was not finished. The individuation was not finished. He had written in the final years about the approach of death with the same qualities of careful attention he had brought to everything else. Not resolution, not final certainty, but a willingness to remain in honest relationship with what he could not yet know. The horizon continued to recede, as it had receded throughout the second half of his life, not as a frustration, but as a confirmation that the self had further to offer than the ego had yet been able to receive. The receding is the reassurance. If the horizon met the walker at some point along the road, and the destination could be reached and sat down in and called complete, then the self would be smaller than the ego, and the entire account would have been wrong. The horizon recedes because the self is genuinely larger than the ego's current capacity to hold, and will continue to be larger regardless of how much the capacity grows. This is not a discouragement. It is a description of scale. There is a particular quality of silence available to the person who has sat with this long enough to stop resenting the recession. It is the silence of someone who has found that the process itself, the ongoing relationship between the ego and the self, the patient labor of attention, the slow accumulation of stones, is not simply a means to an end, but the thing itself. The work is not preparation for something else. The work is what the second half of a life is for. The lake at Bollingen holds that silence on still mornings. The tower stands at the edge of it, slightly crooked in the way of things built by one person's hands over many years, carrying in its irregularity the evidence of the person who built it. Both the building and the builder are part of the same larger process, which continues, which has always been continuing, which does not require anyone to accelerate it tonight. In the stillness of this moment, the work goes on without effort. The self does not need the ego to be awake to continue its organizing. The process that began before consciousness was established continues in the hours when consciousness is quiet, drawing the whole toward whatever form the whole is moving toward. Patient as stone, present as the water that holds the last light on a still evening and shows it back to the sky. The horizon remains somewhere in the dark. It has always been there. It will be there in the morning. For now, the distance between here and there is exactly the right distance. Not a gap to be closed, but a space in which the process lives, open and unhurried, holding the particular life it has been given to hold. In the winter of 1916, Jung sat at a table in Kusnacht and picked up a set of colored pencils. He had been writing for hours, dense, strange pages full of imagery that kept arriving from somewhere he could not fully account for. The writing had exhausted the part of him that used words. Something else reached for the pencils, not because he had decided it should, but because the hand seemed to know before the mind did that a different kind of saying was needed. He drew a circle, then a center, then he divided the whole into four and sat back and looked at what he had made. He did not know what to call it yet. He knew only that making it had settled something in him that no sentence had been able to settle that morning, and that the circle he had drawn was not a picture of an idea, but a record of a condition, his condition on that particular day, rendered in the only language that could hold its shape without distorting it. He would go on drawing circles for years. Each morning's circle became a kind of interior weather report, a way of asking the psyche what it knew that the ego had not yet been told. It was not until much later, when he encountered the Tibetan sand paintings called mandalas, and found in them the same fourfold circle he had been drawing from some inner necessity of his own, that he understood the form itself was older than any individual who had ever drawn it. The hand, it seemed, had been remembering something. The question he kept returning to was a simple one, in the way that questions containing the most territory are always deceptively simple. Why does the unconscious speak the way it speaks? Not in propositions, not in logical chains from premise to conclusion, not in the clear declarative sentences that consciousness prefers, the kind that can be agreed with or argued against. The unconscious, whenever it communicated, through dreams, through images that arrived unbidden during waking hours, through the symbolic forms that rose spontaneously into the artwork of people who had never studied art, spoke always in pictures, in stories, in figures that meant more than any single interpretation could contain. It spoke. Jung came to believe the way the world spoke before anyone had invented a word for anything, concretely, immediately, with the full weight of the thing itself, rather than its name. Freud had also listened to the images the unconscious produced, and Freud's method for doing so was to move away from them. A patient described a dream of a house with many rooms, and Freud's technique of free association followed the chain of whatever the patient happened to think of next, the house suggesting perhaps a childhood home, which suggested a memory, which suggested a feeling that had been buried for years. The image was a doorway, and what mattered was what lay on the other side. Jung grew increasingly uneasy with this approach. To him, the house in the dream was not a doorway to something else. The house was what had arrived. It carried its meaning within itself, in its shape and scale, and the particular quality of its rooms, and to leave it too quickly was to leave behind most of what the unconscious had been at pains to deliver. Jung called his alternative method amplification. The word itself is quiet enough. It only means to make larger, to increase in depth, but what it pointed toward was a fundamentally different relationship to the symbol. In amplification, the analyst and the patient circled the dream image, rather than departing from it. They stayed in its presence and enriched what they understood about it by drawing on every other appearance of that image, in mythology, in religious art, in alchemical manuscripts, in the folklore of cultures the patient had never encountered. They looked at the image from many distances, as one might examine a carved stone by turning it slowly in the light, not to determine what the stone meant, but to see all the ways it caught and held and scattered the light that fell on it. The method trusted that the unconscious had chosen this particular image for reasons worth respecting, and that those reasons were unlikely to be exhausted by the first interpretation that came to mind. To understand why Jung worked this way, it helps to sit with the distinction he drew between two very different kinds of meaning-bearing form. The first he called a sign. A sign points to something already known and agreed upon. The red light hanging above a city intersection is a sign, Everyone who encounters it knows what it points to. The meaning is fixed and settled, and the sign exhausts itself in the pointing. There is nothing left over when the light turns green. The second kind of form Jung called a living symbol, and a living symbol works in the opposite direction. A living symbol does not point efficiently to something already understood. It opens downward into something for which no fully adequate understanding has yet been formed, something that the available concepts approach but cannot contain. A cross, standing in a town square, is not a sign. It is a form that has accumulated 2,000 years of meaning from 10,000 different directions: death and resurrection, sacrifice and redemption, the intersection of the vertical and the horizontal, the meeting of divine and human, the geometric fact of 4 directions and 1 center, and no single interpretation of it, however careful, closes the matter. The cross remains after the interpretation is finished. It goes on meaning. Living symbols, Jung argued, draw their power from the archetypal depths they make visible. They carry a charge that exceeds what any individual mind placed in them, because the individual mind that produced them was not working alone. It was working in collaboration with something much older and much larger, the accumulated symbolic intelligence of a species that had been making sense of the world through images for longer than language had existed to name what the images were. This is why the serpent that appeared in a patient's dream carried weight that no personal history could fully explain. The patient had a personal relationship to serpents, certainly, a memory, an association, a particular feeling the image triggered in them. But the serpent also arrived carrying everything the serpent had ever been, in every culture that had ever given it a role. The serpent of the garden, the serpent coiled around the healing staff of Asclepius, the serpent of Hindu tradition that courses through the body's centers in the form of Kundalini energy, and the alchemical Ouroboros, the great serpent swallowing its own tail in an image of endless circular self-renewal. These were not the patient's associations. They were the serpent's associations, the accumulated weight of what the serpent meant to the species, stored somewhere below the reach of personal memory, available to the image whenever the image appeared. Jung had encountered this weight in one of the most striking moments of his clinical career. A patient came to him, a man with no classical education, no particular interest in ancient history, no reading in mythology or religious literature, and reported a vision he had been having during a period of psychotic disturbance. In the vision, a tube hung from the sun. When the tube swayed, wind was generated, and the wind moved across the earth and gave life to everything it touched. Jung listened and noted the image, and might have moved on, except that he had also been reading at the time a text from the Mithraic liturgy, an ancient mystery religion of the Roman world, and in that text he found almost the same image, reproduced with almost the same vocabulary. A tube hung from the sun. When the tube moved, wind was generated. The text predated the patient by 2,000 years and had been published for the first time only after the patient had reported his vision. There was no chain of ordinary transmission available. The patient had not read the Mithraic text. He could not have read it, and yet something in him had produced its image, as though the image lived in a place below individual memory, available to the unconscious of any human being who descended far enough into the depths. Jung sat very still with that fact. He had already been arguing that the collective unconscious was not a hypothesis, but an empirical observation, a layer of the psyche demonstrably present in the material his patients produced, too consistent across cultures and historical periods to be accounted for by coincidence or borrowing. The Mithraic patient confirmed something he had been building toward for years. The psyche carried a symbolic inheritance no individual had earned through personal experience. It arrived at birth already stocked with images, already capable of generating the forms that every culture had independently generated. Dreams were not the encrypted remnants of a personal past. They were also visits from a much older conversation. This understanding shaped everything Jung said about the mandala. The circular form with a center and a fourfold division had appeared in his own spontaneous drawing in 1916. It appeared in the artwork of patients who had never studied Tibetan Buddhism, medieval Christian cosmology, the Navajo sand paintings used in healing ceremonies, or the geometric diagrams drawn by alchemists in the margins of their manuscripts. It appeared in all of these traditions independently, in cultures that had developed in isolation from one another, across centuries, so distant that direct influence was not possible. The form had been arrived at again and again by different hands that shared only one thing. They were human hands, working from a depth that was not individual. Jung came to understand the mandala as the primary visual symbol of the self, not because he decided it should be, but because the material forced the conclusion on him. The mandala's properties matched, point by point, what the self seemed to be. The circle, a boundary with no beginning and no ending, enclosing without excluding. The center, a point of absolute stillness, around which everything else is organized. The fourfold division, the reconciliation of opposing directions, north and south, and east and west, finding their relation within a single circumscribed whole. In drawing a mandala, the hand was making a picture of what the psyche already was at its deepest level, not fragmented, not partial, not at war with itself, but organized around a center that held. This is why the mandala appeared most reliably in people who were in the middle of psychological turbulence. Jung noticed it first in his own most difficult years, the years following his break with Freud, when his own inner world had become uncertain and strange. He noticed it in patients navigating the disorientation of the midlife passage. He noticed it wherever a person found themselves between the orderly structure of an old life and the not yet formed structure of the next one. The mandala did not cause the stability it pictured. It was rather the psyche's attempt to picture to itself a stability it knew was possible, a center it could return to when everything on the surface had become unreliable. The hand made the circle because the psyche needed to see, in concrete form, that it already had a center. The same logic ran through Jung's understanding of myths and fairy tales. He returned to these repeatedly, not as a scholar cataloging ancient stories, but as a psychologist encountering clinical material. He read a myth the way he listened to a patient's dream, not as a product of individual invention, not as an explanatory story someone had deliberately constructed to account for natural phenomena, but as a spontaneous emergence from the collective unconscious, a symbolic narrative through which a whole culture had processed what no individual mind was large enough to process alone. The hero's descent into the underworld, the monster waiting at the threshold, the difficult task that no ordinary strength can accomplish, the return with something transformed, something brought back from the dark place that the sunlit world needed. These were not arbitrary story elements invented by storytellers who happened to like the same kinds of plots. They were the collective unconscious, speaking at the scale of entire peoples, giving form to experiences that every generation of every culture would need to navigate: the encounter with darkness, the loss of ordinary resources, the discovery of a capacity no one knew they had, the return to ordinary life, changed in ways that could not be explained, but could be lived. A child hearing a fairy tale for the first time, not reading it from a page, but hearing it spoken aloud, in a voice that knows the story matters, will often feel something move in them that is not surprise. This is the part that deserves attention. The child does not know this story yet. The specific names and places and magical objects are new. And yet there is a quality to the feeling that resembles recognition, as though some part of what is being heard has been heard before, not in this life, not in any memory this child could locate, but in some place before memory, before language, before the particular circumstances of this particular existence had defined the boundaries of what was known. The collective unconscious, in Jung's account, is precisely what that feeling points to: the human inheritance of pattern, the stories that were already being told before any individual was born to listen to them. The figures who populated those stories, the hero setting out, the wise old man at the crossroads, the terrible mother who devours, and the nourishing mother who sustains, the trickster who breaks every rule and thereby makes every rule visible, the helpful animal who knows the way. These were not characters invented by writers. They were what Jung called archetypal images, the specific cultural forms taken on by underlying archetypal patterns when those patterns entered consciousness and needed a shape. The pattern itself, the archetype, was not the image. This distinction mattered enormously to Jung. The archetype itself could not be seen. It was a tendency, a readiness, a groove worn deep in the psyche by the repeated experience of the species across thousands of generations. The archetype of the mother was not any particular mother, not the great mother of the Egyptians, not the Black Madonna of medieval Christianity, not the devouring mother of Greek myth. Those were all its images, the forms the underlying pattern had taken in different cultural soils, each one illuminating a different facet of what the pattern contained. The pattern itself remained always just below the image, powering the image from behind, giving it the force that no individual artist's imagination could have generated alone. Jung once described this in terms that made the distinction feel very precise. He had been watching the moon rise over the lake at Bollingen, and he thought the word moon named something available to the eye and to the poem. A poet can use the word and produce a line that catches something real about the quality of moonlight, the coldness of it, the way it falls on still water and makes something visible that daylight does not show. But the moon itself, the gravitational body, the force that pulls the tides, the thing that has been circling the earth for 4.5 billion years and was already old when the first human being looked up and tried to find a sound, to name it, that moon is wholly beyond what any word or poem can reach. The image of the moon can be beautiful and true. The moon itself is simply there, prior to language, prior to perception, the force that everything else describes and nothing describes. The archetype was the moon in that sense. The archetypal image was the poem. Both were real, both mattered, but they were not the same thing, and confusing them, treating the specific cultural image as though it were the pattern itself, as though the Great Mother were all there was to say about the archetype of the mother, was a confusion that closed what should remain open. The pattern was always larger than its current image. That was precisely what made the image a living symbol rather than a sign. The pattern behind it went on exceeding the image's capacity to represent it. Synchronicity entered Jung's thinking along a similar edge, the edge where the available explanations ran out, and something else seemed to be happening. He had been noticing for years that certain meaningful coincidences between inner states and outer events did not seem adequately accounted for by chance. A patient was describing a dream in which she had been given a golden scarab, a symbol of transformation and regeneration in ancient Egyptian tradition, and as she spoke, Jung heard a tapping at the window behind him. He turned and opened the window, and a scarab beetle flew into the room, the closest approximation to a golden scarab that the natural world of Switzerland could offer. He caught it in his hand and turned to his patient. No one in that room believed this had been caused by anything, but the coincidence was too structured, too precisely meaningful in its timing to be described as merely coincidental. Jung spent years thinking carefully about these events. He brought to the problem his friendship with the physicist Wolfgang Pauli, who arrived at Jung's consulting room not as a patient with a simple neurosis, but as a man whose interior life had become unmanageable in ways that the language of quantum physics offered no tools for addressing. Pauli had been dreaming at a depth that alarmed him, and Jung received the dreams with the same care he gave to any empirical material. What developed between them was not the expected exchange, doctor and patient, analyst and analysand, but something more like a sustained collaboration between two men who had each reached the edge of what their discipline could hold, and suspected the other was standing at a different edge of the same void. Pauli's physics had discovered that at the quantum level, the observer could not be cleanly separated from what was being observed. The act of measurement altered the thing being measured. The boundary between the knowing subject and the known object was not as absolute as classical physics had assumed. Jung's psychology had arrived at something structurally similar from the opposite direction. The psyche was not cleanly contained within the skull, and the sharp line between inner event and outer event, the line that made coincidence merely coincidental, might not be as final as ordinary consciousness assumed. Out of this collaboration came the concept Jung called synchronicity, the meaningful coincidence of an inner psychic state and an outer event, where the connection between them is not causal, but meaningful in a way that causation cannot fully account for. The emphasis on meaning was careful and deliberate. Jung was not claiming that mind caused matter, or that the psyche reached out and arranged events in the world to match its contents. He was claiming something more modest, and in some ways more strange, that at the deepest levels of the psyche, and perhaps at the deepest levels of physical reality, the boundary between inside and outside became permeable in ways that the ordinary categories of cause and effect could not cleanly describe. Events rhymed. The inner and the outer occasionally arrived together in configurations so precisely fitted to one another that the only honest language for what was happening was the language of meaning rather than mechanism. Jung thought synchronistic events were particularly likely to occur when the self was at work, when something in the deeper layers of the psyche was in motion, when a person stood at a threshold between one life and another, when the unconscious had something it was attempting to communicate, and the usual channels were insufficient. The meaningful coincidence was not a message in any simple sense. It was more like a pressure, the sense that the symbolic world was not separate from the lived world, that images and events were not confined to their respective domains, that the mandala one drew in the morning and the beetle that arrived at the window were both expressions of the same underlying movement. They were both the language the depths preferred, concrete, immediate, impossible to argue with, and impossible to fully explain. This is what Jung meant when he said that myths were the dreams of entire peoples. The myth did not arise from the deliberate imagination of an individual storyteller who decided to give the forces of nature a narrative form. The myth arose the way a dream arises, from the collective depths, fully formed in its essential structure, needing only the specific cultural clothing that each age and place provided. The hero and the serpent, And the descent and the return, these did not change across cultures because they were not inventions of any culture. They were the shape that the collective unconscious gave to certain universal experiences, the same way the hand gave a fourfold circle to the experience of seeking wholeness, not because someone had decided that was the appropriate form, but because the form was already there, waiting to be found, already inscribed in the psyche before any particular hand picked up any particular pencil. The recurring images of the wise elder, the helpful animal, the impossible task that turns out to be possible through some quality the hero did not know they possessed. These were not conventions of storytelling in the way that, say, the three-act structure is a convention of drama. They were the collective unconscious articulating, in story form, what it knew about the structure of inner development. The helpful animal knew the path because the instinctual layer of the psyche, older than reasoning, older than language, older than the elaborate social structures the persona had been built to navigate, retained a knowledge of the way that the rational mind had not yet learned to access. The wise elder appeared at the moment when the hero had no resources left, because that was the moment the deeper layer of the psyche became available, when ordinary competence had been exhausted. Something older and steadier came forward. The impossible task was never solved by the method the hero first tried, because the method available at the beginning was the method of the ego, and what was needed was the method of the self, wider, slower, less obviously useful, and entirely adequate. Jung drew mandalas each morning for years. He described this practice in retrospect as a kind of taking his own psychological temperature, not a discipline imposed from outside, not a technique learned from a teacher, but a response to an interior pressure that required a form. The circle appeared because the psyche needed to make its condition visible to itself. The fourfold division appeared because the psyche was, at that level, always working with opposites and their reconciliation, the pairs of functions, the masculine and the feminine, the conscious and the unconscious, the individual and the collective. The center appeared because the psyche already knew, even when the ego did not, that there was a center, and that the center held. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the language the depths prefer. It is not a language the ego invents or controls or fully comprehends. The ego encounters it. The ego receives it. The ego can learn, through careful attention, to read it with greater skill, to sit with a dream image long enough to let it speak, rather than immediately translating it into something the conscious mind is more comfortable with. But the language itself predates the ego's involvement by an immeasurable distance. It was being spoken before any particular person was born to hear it. In the dreams and visions, in cave paintings and ritual images of people who lived so long ago that nothing of their individual lives remains except the images they made and the symbolic patterns, those images repeated, generation after generation, with a fidelity that could only mean the images were not made up, but found, located in a place that every generation had access to, because that place was not a historical period, but a depth. When Jung made his first mandala in 1916, he was not inventing a symbol. He was, in some sense, being reminded of one. The colored pencils in his hand moved toward a form that had been moving toward the hand for as long as there had been hands to make it. The circle returned to its center. The four directions arranged themselves around a stillness, and something that could not be named in any language, something that the image only approximated without exhausting, rested quietly behind the drawing, present the way the moon is present behind the poem, prior to every word the poem finds, available always, neither requiring explanation nor waiting for one. A living symbol is never finished doing its work. This is the quality that distinguishes it from a sign, from an efficient pointer to something already settled and known. A living symbol keeps meaning. Long after the interpretation has been offered and considered, and in the honest way of such things, found to be partial, the symbol remains, the cross remains, the serpent remains, the circle with a center and a fourfold division remains. The hero at the threshold of the underworld remains. These images go on saying what they have always been saying in whatever cultural soil they happen to be growing in, to whatever generation happens to have the patience and the quiet to receive them. They do not require understanding before they can be received. They require only the particular readiness that comes from having set down, for the moment, the insistence that everything must first be translated before it can be allowed to matter. In that setting down, in that unhurried willingness to remain in the presence of something that exceeds what any interpretation can close, the depths find the opening they have always been waiting for, and they speak in the only language they have ever known. In circles with centers, in serpents and scarabs and heroes descending, in the image that arrives from somewhere older than memory and settles without explanation into its place. Jung, in his 80s, sat outside the stone tower he had built at Bullingen as the last light crossed the surface of the lake. The water held the color a long time after the sky had let it go. He had a cup of something warm. He had a wall at his back that he had raised stone by stone over decades, and he had the question he had been carrying since before either the wall or the tower existed. The question that had kept him company through the years, the way a good silence keeps company, not demanding anything, not going anywhere, simply present in the way that the oldest and most honest things tend to be present. The question was not finished. He was not finished with it. But somewhere in those last years, the relationship between the man and the question had shifted, quietly and without announcement, from a relationship of effort to a relationship of rest. That shift is what the whole of his work had been moving toward, not an answer, not a terminus, something more like the moment a long conversation stops being an argument and becomes simply two presences, sitting together in the particular warmth of having lasted. Kant was in Königsberg. He was always in Königsberg. He walked the same route through the city every day with such regularity that neighbors were said to have set their clocks by his passage, and he spent the decades of his productive life in a study from which he did not need to travel because the territory he was mapping was entirely interior. It was the territory of the mind itself, what the mind can know, how the mind constructs the world it inhabits, and where the mind's outward reach must finally stop. What Kant found at that final boundary was the thing in itself, the noumenon, the reality behind the appearance, the thing that must exist for any appearance to be given, but which the mind can never directly encounter, because every encounter involves the mind's own categories, its own structuring operations, its own imposition of time and space and cause. The world as it is, independent of any observer, remains permanently beyond the reach of any observer. The mind touches only the world as it appears, and what the world is, entirely on its own terms, in the dark behind all appearance, in the silence before any perception begins, that remains unknowable. Jung had read Kant carefully. He returned to Kant often. The thing in itself gave him something he needed, a philosophical warrant for the humility his psychology required. When he spoke of the self, he was not claiming to describe a metaphysical substance. He was not asserting that some transcendent entity existed behind the psyche, the way a noumenon exists behind a phenomenon. He was describing a psychic reality, something that moved, that organized, that communicated, that left unmistakable traces in dreams and images and the felt direction of a life. But what that reality ultimately was, in itself, in whatever darkness lay behind the psychic images through which it appeared, that he would not claim, the self, as Jung used the term, is always the self as it appears, the archetype as image, the organizing center as felt in the experiences it generates. Behind the experiences, behind the images, behind the organizing pull, the thing itself remains exactly where Kant placed everything that matters most. Just beyond, always just beyond, present in its effects the way a gravitational body is present in the bending of light around it, never seen directly, never needing to be. There is a kind of peace in that. The thing Kant found frustrating, the permanent inaccessibility of the thing in itself, Jung seems to have found livable, even companionable. The self does not need to be fully known, it needs to be met. And the meeting happens in the images, in the dreams that rise before waking, in the dreams that have not yet been dreamed, in the quiet space between one breath and the next, in the hours before morning. The Gnostics had a different vocabulary for the same territory. They were mystics and theologians, and Jung believed, psychologists of an unusually honest kind, people who had looked directly at the interior life, without flinching, and had described what they found there in the only language available to them, which was the language of myth and theology and cosmic drama, the divine spark, the pneuma, the fragment of transcendent light that had become trapped in the heaviness of matter and the confusion of ordinary life, and that yearned. The word the Gnostics used carries a weight no translation quite preserves. Yearned to be recognized, to return to its source, to complete the long arc of its journey home. Jung was drawn to the Gnostics, the way a person is drawn to someone who has had the same dream. The pneuma is not a theological doctrine, it is a description of something felt. It is what it feels like to live with the obscure, persistent sense that what one most essentially is has not yet found its way to the surface, that beneath the biography, beneath the social identity, beneath the history of choices and errors and partial successes, something older and less particular waits, patient, unhurried, carrying the light of a source. The Dale itself has almost forgotten. Jung called that something the self. The Gnostics called it the pneuma. The names are different. The experience they are pointing at is not. What the Gnostic tradition added to the picture that even the most careful Kantian analysis could not easily supply was the quality of longing. The self, in Jung's framework, is not merely a structural principle, not merely an organizing center, not merely the circumference of the total personality. It aches, it pulls, it communicates with an urgency that the philosophical vocabulary of structure and function has difficulty conveying, and the Gnostic image of the divine spark, trapped in the heaviness of ordinary life, straining upward through layers of forgetting and confusion toward a source it has not seen, but somehow still knows. That image captures something about the lived experience of individuation that no purely structural account can hold. The Upanishads arrived in Europe's philosophical consciousness in the early 19th century and produced in many European thinkers what could only be described as a shock of recognition. Schopenhauer was among the first and most vociferous. He read the ancient Indian texts and felt, he said, the greatest consolation of his life, the sense that what he had arrived at through the long labor of his own philosophical work, the West had already been living with in the East for 2,000 years. What the Upanishads hold, in their oldest and most concentrated form, is a claim about identity. The Atman, the innermost self, the self beneath the biographical self, the self that breathes before the name was given and will breathe after the name is forgotten, is identical with Brahman, the universal ground of all being, the undivided reality from which the multiplicity of individual lives arises like waves from the surface of deep water. Not similar to Brahman, not aligned with Brahman, not a reflection of Brahman, identical. The distinction the ordinary mind draws between the particular and the universal, between the bounded individual and the unbounded ground, is, from the perspective the Upanishads are pointing toward, a kind of error, not a moral error, not a failure of will, but a perceptual error. The way of fog is an error about the distinction between what is above and what is below. Jung sat with this claim carefully. He did not simply import it. He was not looking for an Eastern teaching to confirm a Western discovery. He was looking for what was true, and he was following the evidence wherever it led. And the evidence kept leading to places where the same shape appeared in different languages. The self in his psychology is not the Atman. The concepts are not interchangeable. But when a Jungian analyst and a scholar of the Upanishads sit across from each other and begin to describe carefully what they mean by the terms they use, something happens between the two accounts. A recognition, not of identity. The traditions are distinct, their methods are different, their metaphysical commitments diverge at important points, but of resonance, of the two separate traditions having arrived by different paths in the same general country. That country has no agreed name. The Upanishads call it the self. Jung calls it the self. The similarity in naming may be partly coincidence or partly translation, but the philosophical substance the name is pointing toward, the sense that what a person most essentially is, extends further than the biographical self has reached, deeper than the ego has looked, quieter than any of the inner voices that usually claim to speak for the whole. That is not coincidence. That is the same fact discovered twice, from two directions. Heidegger published Being and Time in 1927. He was 37 years old, and he had spent years, patient and relentless, trying to ask what he considered the most fundamental question available, not what particular things there are, not how to live among them well, but what it means for anything to be at all, being. The question that Western philosophy had asked at the beginning, and then Heidegger argued, had covered over with so many other questions that the original question had become invisible, the way a path becomes invisible when enough grass grows across it. Inside that enormous inquiry, Heidegger found a smaller and more intimate one. Human beings are distinctive among things that exist because they are the kind of beings for whom their own existence is always a question. A stone does not wonder what it is to be a stone. A river does not hold the question of its own being open. But a human being, what Heidegger called Dasein, being there, existence situated in a specific time and place, and set of possibilities, carries its own existence as an open question, and can either face that openness or flee it. Fleeing, it takes a specific and very recognizable form. Heidegger called it das Man, the they, the anonymous background of social agreement about what counts as a proper life, a proper ambition, a proper way of spending a Thursday afternoon. Das Man does not issue commands, it does not need to. It operates as the default, the gravity of collective assumption that draws every individual toward the average, the unremarkable, the publicly sanctioned, and easily legible. Most lives, most of the time, are lived largely in Das Man, not because the people living them are weak or uncritical, but because the pull is constant and subtle and largely invisible, which is precisely what makes it so effective. Against this pull, Heidegger set what he called the call of conscience. not the conscience of social morality, not the voice that says one has broken a rule, something more interior and less verbal, a call from Das Man itself to its own most possibilities, a disruption of the anonymous comfort of Das Man, a pull toward what one most specifically and irreplaceably is, as distinct from what the collective has decided it is reasonable to be. The call has no content. It does not arrive with instructions or a program. It arrives as a kind of clearing, a moment of owning one's existence, of standing, even briefly, in relation to the specific life one is actually living, rather than the general life Das Man has prepared. The structural parallel to Jung is obvious enough that it requires almost no elaboration, which is one reason it is worth pausing with the one significant difference rather than the many resemblances. Heidegger's call of conscience has no content. It points toward authenticity without specifying what authenticity requires. The call clears the space, the individual must fill it. Jung's self communicates with an entirely different richness. It does not merely clear, it shows. It speaks in images and symbols, in the specific figures of dreams, in the particular forms of synchronistic events, in the repeated themes of a life. The call in Jungian psychology has content, it insists, it returns. It brings to each night's dreaming a specific configuration that reflects the specific distance between where the ego has arrived and where the self requires the life to move. Both accounts describe a pull away from the impersonal toward the irreducibly personal. Both insist that what is lost in the drift toward Das Man, toward the persona, toward the socially legible and collectively approved version of a life, what is lost is not a luxury, but an essential. But Heidegger's account leaves the individual alone with the structure of that pull, while Jung's account gives the individual company a vast interior that has been listening the entire time and has not run out of things to say. Kierkegaard was in Copenhagen in 1849 when he wrote The Sickness unto Death under a pseudonym he used when he wanted the argument to travel further than his name would carry it. He was 46 years old. He had spent his life in the peculiar double occupation of a man who writes relentlessly about the necessity of choosing, while being constitutionally incapable of making the ordinary choices most lives require. He had broken an engagement. He had never married. He had written prolifically, suffered considerably, and arrived at a definition of despair that has not been improved upon. Despair, in Kierkegaard's account, is not grief. It is not sadness. It is not the natural response to loss or disappointment or the failure of an external hope. It is something more specific and more interior, the failure to be oneself, the failure that consists not in doing wrong, but in being, persistently and systematically, other than what one most essentially is. A person can be failing in this sense while succeeding by every external measure. A person can be competent, admired, comfortable, and in despair because the life they are living, the self they are performing, the choices they are making, the investments they are maintaining, does not correspond to the self that is most deeply and irreplaceably theirs. Kierkegaard called the most intense form of this despair the despair of not willing to be oneself, the deliberate, if unconscious, flight from the specific weight and light of one's own existence, the preference for the general, the socially approved, the easily categorized, over the terrifying specificity of what one actually is. Jung never cited Kierkegaard directly as a primary influence, but the resonance between the two accounts runs so deep that the absence of citation matters less than the presence of the thought. For Jung, The failure to individuate produces a particular kind of psychological death in life, a state in which the ego, having aligned itself entirely with the persona, has lost contact with the deeper demands of the self and goes on living, very often with apparent success, in a kind of metabolic suspension, not suffering dramatically, not in visible crisis, but no longer growing toward the form the psyche was always already inclined toward, no longer receiving from the unconscious the nourishment that only contact with the deeper layers can supply. Both thinkers are describing the same fact from different angles. Kierkegaard approaches it as a theologian and existentialist, placing the failure of selfhood in the context of a relationship with the eternal. Jung approaches it as a psychologist and empiricist, placing the failure in the context of a psychic organism deprived of its own deepest resource. But the fact they are describing, the particular kind of loss that consists not in losing something outside, but in losing contact with something within, is the same. It is a loss that has no obvious external symptom. It does not announce itself. It simply settles, gradually and without drama, into the texture of how a life feels from the inside. And both thinkers held that recovery, from Kierkegaard's despair, from Jung's failure to individuate, passes through the same gate, the willingness to turn toward what has been avoided, to receive what the self most deeply offers, even when the offering arrives in forms the ego has not ordered and would not have chosen. Paul Tillich was born in Germany in 1886 and spent years finding the language adequate to what he wanted to say. He was a theologian who had been shaken loose from easy certainty by 2 world wars and the particular philosophical rigors of a century that had made every inherited framework difficult to hold without examination. What he found, after the shaking, was not certainty but something sturdier, a way of speaking about the ground of being that did not require the comfortable furniture of traditional religion, while still pointing at what traditional religion had always been, in its most honest moments, pointing at. Tillich published The Courage to Be in 1952. He was 66 years old, and he had been living with the question of courage for a long time. Not courage in the ordinary sense, the bravery of physical danger, the steadiness of external hardship, a more fundamental kind, the courage required to affirm one's own existence in the face of the anxiety that accompanies it, the anxiety of meaninglessness, the anxiety of guilt, the anxiety of the fact that one will not always be. All of this is present in a human life, quietly or loudly, and the question Tillich was asking is, what makes it possible to go on affirming one's existence when all of this is also true? His answer was the ground of being, not God as a separate entity existing somewhere above or beyond the world, not the God of naive theism available for petition and susceptible to disappointment, the power of being itself, the transcendent ground that underlies all existence, in which all particular existences participate, whether they are aware of it or not, from which the courage to be in the face of anxiety ultimately draws its substance. Genuine self-affirmation, Tillich argued, is never merely the isolated ego asserting its own importance against the darkness. It is the ego affirming itself as participant in something that does not share its fragility. The courage to be is always at its deepest level a participation in the ground of being. The parallel to Jung's self does not require forcing. In both accounts, there is a reality deeper than the isolated ego, deeper, more stable, more encompassing, in which the individual participates and from which the individual draws resources the ego alone cannot generate. In both accounts, they encounter with anxiety, with meaninglessness, with the darkness that accompanies existence, That encounter is not something to be avoided or resolved prematurely, but something to be moved through, because what is on the other side of the honest encounter is not the absence of darkness, but the presence of a ground that the darkness has not reached and cannot reach. Tillich's language is theological. Jung's language is psychological. Jung's language is psychological. But the experience they are both describing, the experience of finding, in the deepest layer of one's own existence, a stability that does not originate with the ego and is not dependent on the ego's fortunes, that experience has a single character. Whether it is approached through the language of grace or the language of individuation, whether it announces itself as the ground of being or the self. William James had been there before both of them, in his quieter and more empirical way. James spent years listening to people describe their most interior experiences, experiences of conversion, of mystical dissolution, of the sudden sense that the ordinary boundaries of the self had opened and something larger had entered. He was a psychologist before psychology had fully settled into its present form, and he brought to his listening a philosophical seriousness and a personal openness that most of his contemporaries could not manage. What James found, sorting through the testimonies, was a pattern. At the edge of ordinary consciousness, in the moments when the self was under pressure, or in the stillness of extended prayer, or at the threshold of sleep, something arrived that was not the ordinary ego, something that felt larger, older, more stable, and more knowing. James called it, tentatively, the subliminal self. He was careful with the term. He was not claiming to describe its ultimate nature. He was describing what the testimonies reported. He was taking the reports seriously as data, the way a careful scientist takes any repeated observation seriously. Jung had read James. James had died in 1910, and Jung was already at work on the theories that would occupy him for the rest of his life. There is no direct line of influence to be drawn, no simple teacher-student relationship to be identified, but there is something else, the recognition, in James's careful empirical attention to the edge of ordinary consciousness, of the same territory Jung was mapping from a different entrance. James entered through the testimonies of religious experience. Jung entered through the clinical evidence of the unconscious. Both found, at the interior edge of the human self, a threshold beyond which the ordinary account of a bounded individual life becomes inadequate. Both also found that the experience of crossing that threshold, even partially, even briefly, was not typically experienced as loss or dissolution, but as arrival. The sense, in James's accounts, was not of the self being swept away. It was of the self being expanded, of something that had been cramped becoming, without announcement, larger. The question the whole tradition has been circling, from Kant's study in Königsberg, to Kierkegaard's Copenhagen desk, to Heidegger's Freiburg lecture halls, to Tillich's post-war theological rebuilding, to James's patient, listening to the reports of those at the edge of ordinary experience, to Jung's own long sitting with what his patients dreamed, and what his own interior offered in the years he spent mapping it, is a question that has no agreed formulation. It is asked differently in each tradition, with different vocabulary, different method, different emphasis, but it is, at its center, always the same question. The question of what a self most essentially is. The question of whether the bounded biographical individual is the whole fact or a fragment of it. The question of what lies beyond the lit room of ordinary awareness, in the darkness that is nonetheless full. No one has finished answering it. The tradition does not converge on a resolution. Each serious engagement with the question produces not closure, but a more precise articulation of why the question remains open. which is itself a kind of progress, or at least a kind of honesty that a merely comfortable philosophy could not afford. Jung knew this. He had spent 60 years with the question, and he knew, sitting outside the stone tower at Bollingen in the last light, that what he had produced was not an answer, but a more detailed map of the question's terrain. He had named more of the interior. He had drawn the borders of the unconscious with more care than most who had attempted it. He had given language to experiences that had been largely without language: the self, the archetype, the shadow, the individuation that moves through a whole life like a tide that cannot be stopped, only attended to or ignored. But the thing itself, the self in itself, the ground behind the psychic images, the noumenon behind the phenomena of the interior life, that remained exactly where Kant had left the thing in itself, just beyond, always just beyond, not as a frustration, but as a guarantee that the inquiry is not yet exhausted, that the ground is deeper than any map of it, that the circumference of who a person is extends further than any named territory. What the tradition offers, taken whole, Kant and the Gnostics and the Upanishads, and Heidegger and Kierkegaard, and Tillich and James and Jung, is not a doctrine. It is a company, the company of thinkers who sat with the same question and found that sitting with it, honestly and without demanding resolution, produced not anxiety, but a particular kind of rest. The rest of having asked the hardest thing one knows to ask, and having followed the asking far enough to discover that the asking itself is a form of contact with something that holds, that does not require the question to be finished, that was present before the question began and will be present after it ends. Kant walked his daily route through Königsberg and reached the boundary of what could be known, and found, at that boundary, not despair, but the clean philosophical satisfaction of a limit precisely identified. Kierkegaard wrote through his despair and found, at its deepest point, not the absence of self, but the ground on which a genuine self could stand. Heidegger cleared the forest of Das Mann and found the call, contentless but unmistakable, of what one most specifically and irreplaceably is. Tillich moved through the anxiety of existence and found beneath it a ground that the anxiety had never touched. James listened to the edge cases and found, at the threshold of ordinary consciousness, the consistent testimony of something larger. And Jung drew his mandalas each morning in the years after everything had broken open, and the circles came, not from intention, not from study, not from a program of recovery or a philosophy of healing. They came the way the horizon comes, the way depth comes, the way the self always comes, not manufactured, not arrived at by effort, but recognized. Recognized the way one recognizes something that has been present all along, waiting with the patience of something that has nowhere else to be. The stone wall at Bollingen is still there. The tower Jung built in layers over decades, each layer added when the interior required it, stands on the shore of the lake. The light that caught the water on those last evenings is long gone, but the question that he carried out there, the question of what the self is, of what inhabits the full circumference of a person's being, of what is living in the house beyond the lit room, that question is not gone. It is the same age it has always been. It does not age. It waits in the same patience the stone wall waits, in the same patience the lake waits, in the same patience whatever is deepest in any human life has always waited, through every hour of every night, for the ordinary mind to tire itself into quiet. The ordinary mind does tire. This is one of its great virtues. It argues and plans and loops through the unsettled inventory of a day, and eventually, always, it grows still. not because it has finished, but because the work of the waking self has reached its limit for one night, and something older and more patient takes over the hours that remain. In those hours below the threshold of directed thought, below the surface of the biographical self, with its name and its worries and its small daily jurisdiction, something continues. Something holds the breathing steady. Something keeps the blood moving, keeps the body warm, maintains in the darkness the conditions for what will rise again as morning. That something has been called many things in many traditions. Kant pointed toward it and named the pointing's limit. Kierkegaard ached toward it and named the aching sickness and its cure. Heidegger circled it and named the clearing it requires. Tillich stood in it and named the ground it offers. Jung spent a long life looking at what it left in the psyche when it passed through the images, the symbols, the organizing pull, the mandala's circular form drawn by a hand that knew something the waking mind was still learning, and named it the self.